8. The Tank Graveyard of Asmara. The tank graveyard in Asmara, a city in the eastern African country of Eritrea, is a labyrinth filled with rows of rusted tanks, trucks, and other crashed vehicles. As you walk through this area, you might notice bits and pieces of ammunition, as well as metal plates with the letters CCCP, which stands for the USSR in the Cyrillic alphabet, stamped on them, scattered throughout the pathways and decorated with bundles of cacti that offer treats for local children that were brave enough to climb in and get them. But this place is much more than a collection of abandoned military equipment. It holds an unsettling historical significance as a lasting reminder of one of Africa's longest waged conflicts, the Eritrean War of Independence. This war lasted for 30 years, from 1961 to 1991. Eritrea fought to free themselves from the reigns of Ethiopian rule. During this bloody period, where 125,000 people lost their lives, Ethiopia, with support from the Soviet Union up north, had a formidable army equipped with tanks, trucks, cars, and machinery, much of which you can see in the tank graveyard to this day. Eritrean soldiers, on the other hand, had to use whatever they could find, even making sandals from old tires and relying on captured enemy weapons for defense. Despite the shocking difference in strength and resources of the two parties, Eritrea's determination and unwillingness to step down conquered, and they somehow destroyed the majority of the weaponry and vehicles sent by Ethiopia. Humiliated by the disappointing defeat, Ethiopia tried to brush the evidence of their losses under the rug by storing damaged equipment outside the capital city of Asmara, with the hope that the enemy wouldn't get a boost of morale from realizing just how many vehicles they took out. In 1991, when Eritrea finally came out victorious in the conflict, soldiers gathered all the military hardware they could and transformed it into what's now known as the Tank Graveyard. Today, the site has evolved into a public viewing space that a select few tourists who manage to travel to Eritrea can explore. To the local Eritrean population, it represents a source of pride as a symbol of their struggle for freedom. 7. The SS Gasstopper. Under the water near the Irish coast, there's a military shipwreck that's worth its weight not in gold, but silver. The SS Gasstopper was a British transport ship that operated in World War II. In February 1941, it was carrying a cargo worth £600,000 worth of silver, with hopes of transporting it to the United States for safety while the country was being bombarded during the Blitz. But the Gasstopper didn't make it to its intended destination, since it was torpedoed by a German U-boat. The ship sank beneath the waves, taking the silver down with it. You'd think that considering how much silver was on the ship, as soon as it was safe to do so after the war, the British might try to recover the Gasstopper bounty. But instead, it lay abandoned under the waves for decades, until in 2011, a group of US treasure hunters were able to locate the wreckage, 15,419 feet under the water, from the Irish coast. No wonder the British couldn't get to it. It seems like any chance of getting the silver is impossible, which is a shame given the value the metal would hold today. Back in 1941, the cargo had a value of £600,000. Today, it would be worth a staggering $210 million. 6. An armored vehicle on a Nebraska highway. In August 2020, traffic officials in Nebraska were baffled when they found an abandoned car on the side of the highway. It wasn't exactly something you'd expect to see, like a car or even a truck, but instead, blocking traffic was an armored vehicle. They were far away from any military bases, and the vehicle with its huge tracks wasn't exactly the best thing to speed down Interstate 80 inside of. So where exactly did it come from, and who did it belong to? It didn't belong to a private owner, and officials quickly worked out that it belonged to the South Dakota National Guard. Turns out that the armored vehicle was used in training drills and exercises conducted by the National Guard in California, so it was on its way back to South Dakota being hauled by a private company. But the driver and his vehicle and trailer were nowhere in sight. Thankfully, the abandoned armored vehicle was taken back to the South Dakota National Guard, but no one knows exactly why it was originally left there. What's the weirdest thing you've seen parked at the side of the road? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe while you're at it. 5. RAF Folkingham. If you head over to Lincolnshire in the UK, you'll find a treasure trove of abandoned military cars, enough to fill up an entire landing strip. RAF Folkingham was opened back in 1940 as part of the war effort for World War II. Ironically, when it was initially commissioned, there weren't any working vehicles at all on site. Instead, the airfield was full of fake airplanes and personnel, designed to serve as a decoy for the more important RAF Spitalgate, located not far from it. Over time, RAF Folkingham started being used as an actual airbase by the Royal Air Force and the US Air Force. Soldiers were even sent from Folkingham to Normandy to take part in the D-Day landings. They dropped into the battle via parachute. Once World War II concluded, tensions were still high with the start of the Cold War. As a result, Folkingham was reutilized as a ballistic missile base, with weapons ready and primed for the Cuban Missile Crisis that took place in 1962. But less than a year later, RAF Folkingham was officially decommissioned, and the land was sold off to private ownership, along with a heap of scrap vehicles that were left at the site. Over time, the vehicles, like a Caterpillar tractor, DUKW amphibious vehicle, and military refueling engines, have been overtaken by rust and nature, with many of them being swallowed up by shrubbery. Once upon a time, many of them were critical to the D-Day landings at Normandy in 1944, a moment that tipped the scales of World War II. Apparently, the vehicles are still being used for scrap and spare parts, but with how long they've spent rusting away, we're unsure what these historical war machines will serve. 4. The abandoned vehicles of the war in Afghanistan. The USA had a military presence in Afghanistan for over 20 years, from 2001 to 2021, to fight the Taliban and help the Afghan government. But what happened to the 20 years worth of vehicles left overseas? The US withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021 was quick and extremely chaotic, with troops leaving the country fast after the collapse of the ruling party they'd been helping. Coincidentally, many vehicles and pieces of infrastructure were left behind, along with others that had been given to the Afghan army. Of course, they weren't in pristine condition, and many were damaged by the retreating forces so they couldn't be used by the enemy. But it seems like the attempts to deliberately sabotage the $7 billion worth of vehicles left behind didn't go as well as the US forces first thought. In March 2023, 2 years after the US left Afghanistan, a picture was posted to Twitter showing rows and rows of US Army vehicles, including Humvees, mine-resistant armored cars, and more. The 300-odd vehicles had been taken over by the Taliban, and they'd spent the last 2 years repairing them to be operational again. 3. $1 Million Point. Santo in Vanuatu was a critical base for the US while engaged in the Pacific theater of World War II. During their occupation of the island, the Americans brought in personnel, developed roads and infrastructure, and brought over items to make island living during war just a bit more bearable. In 1945, after the conclusion of the war, the US no longer needed to be in Vanuatu anymore, so the time came for them to withdraw and for many to return to civilian life. There was one problem though. The war stripped a lot of money and resources from the state, so transporting all of the assets back would be more trouble than it was worth. The army decided to only bring back the troops, leaving everything else behind. They later decided to sell the resources to the French, who had control over Vanuatu back then. They approached the governors of the island with an offer to buy the goods at a value of 6 cents on the dollar, a major discount. But the French knew exactly how desperate the US was to get rid of everything, so they turned down the deal, believing they would get everything for free later on once patience wore thin. The US was incredibly insulted when their offer was refused, and decided that if they didn't want to buy them, no one could have them. under the cover of darkness, the US mobilized, ready to start a 2-day operation at Luganville Beach, dumping every last thing they brought into the water. This included small items like bottles of cola, all the way up to large vehicles and machinery like armored trucks and even bulldozers. It was all left to disappear under the waves. As the final cherry on the cake, they blew up and destroyed the jetty they built to drive the vehicles into the water. After the US left, the area gained a new name. Thanks to the immense value of the goods dumped there, the region became known as Million Dollar Point. To this day, visitors can spot junk left over from this period in history, and those able to dive or snorkel can spot the rusted and barnacle-covered remains of vehicles that were ceremoniously dumped there. 2. A Russian MiG-23. The island of Sakhalin is in the Sea of Okhotsk, around the northwest region of the Pacific Ocean. As a result of this, the area has been a subject of territorial disputes by both Japan and Russia, with both countries fighting over who actually owned it for centuries. In 1855, an agreement was finally reached, leading to the division of the island, with Japan taking control of the northern half and Russia having ownership of the south. This agreement continued up until Russia's defeat in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, when Japan reasserted control over the southern region of the island. But the island of Sakhalin changed hands once again in 1945, when after World War II, the Soviet Union invaded Sakhalin, taking it over completely. During the period of Japanese rule over the southern side of Sakhalin, the army constructed an airfield known as Khiton. After the Soviet takeover, this facility was transformed into the Smernik Air Base, which housed 3 squadrons of Tupolev Tu bombers. It was also the base of Fighter Regiment 528. Over time, Fighter Regiment 528 brought in several types of aircraft to the site. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Smernik Fighter Regiment was disbanded around 1994. The base was closed down, and its MiG-23 ML aircraft were moved to Kbra on the Russian mainland, where they were held for storage and eventual dismantling. Not all of the aircraft were taken off of the island though. 2 planes remained abandoned. The first was a 2-seater MiG-23 once used for training, and the other was a single-seater. Although we don't know exactly where the 2-seater plane ended up, brave explorers can find tucked away in a hangar covered by a layer of snow what remains of the single-seater. It's in quite the sorry state, since the entirety of its nose is now missing, as well as its radar equipment. The cockpit's also been ripped off, as well as the landing gear, almost as if it had been partially scrapped already before Fighter Regiment 528 even left the island. On its side, the Soviet Red Star still remains proudly shining in place, although partially adapted with white and blue edging to signify the fall of the communist regime. 1. The Kbra Island tanks. Kbra Island in Puerto Rico is truly a tropical paradise, with clear waters and white sandy beaches. So the last thing you'd expect to see hidden in the corner of Flamenco Beach is a load of rusting World War II tanks. The story starts to make more sense when you realize that Kbra has had military ties for over a century. When Puerto Rico was given to the US by the Spanish in 1901, Kbra was signed off to the Navy by President Theodore Roosevelt. The Navy then used the land on Kbra that they'd been given to perform test landings and ground maneuvers, and even started bombing and target practice. Understandably, this usage angered the locals, especially since in 1969 the US Navy dropped bombs and fired missiles 228 days out of the year in preparation for Vietnam. That means they were disturbed by bombs basically every 2 out of 3 days. Unrest quickly grew, and the Navy soon tried to evacuate the people of Kbra from their homes. Instead, the locals rebelled, and for 7 months in 1970, they staged non-violent protests, sit-ins and blockades against the military usage of the island. Eventually, the military caved, and everything was scheduled to be moved from Kbra by 1975. Although the Navy had 5 years to clear their equipment that was used at the former testing site, it seems they weren't as thorough as you might expect. They left behind a host of items, many of which the local people of Kbra had to clean up themselves. Among these items the Navy left, though, were a load of World War II tanks which they had been using for target practice, which were far too heavy to be moved. As a result, the tanks were left where they stood on Flamenco Beach, slowly being rusted away by the sea's salty water and gradually covered in colourful graffiti. Thanks for watching. Which one of these abandoned vehicles would you be the most shocked to discover in the wild? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos. We'll see you next time. Bye.